In the stillness of early morning, long before the sun dares to rise over the frostbitten fields of northern France, you wake to the sound of coughing, boots scuffing wooden floorboards, and the soft murmur of restless bodies. The air is heavy with the scent of unwashed clothes, damp straw, and the faint memory of last night's thin cabbage soup. You reach up, brushing hay from your tangled hair, and glance across the cramped barracks. All around you, young men like yourself stir from their uneasy sleep, faces pale, eyes hollow, dreams interrupted by the biting cold and aching limbs. Your name is Jean Dupont. You are 19 years old. 6 months ago, you were shaping bread in your father's bakery. Now you are a soldier in the Grande Armée of Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte, a name that once seemed distant, almost mythical, but now dictates every step you take. Your stomach growls, echoing across your ribs like a drumbeat of desperation. You have not had a full meal in days. Food is rationed, and what little you get is barely enough to keep your legs moving. You sit up slowly, feeling every bruise, every blister rubbed raw by the stiff leather of your government-issued boots. Still, you are one of the lucky ones. Some men in your company march barefoot or wrap their feet in rags torn from the uniforms of the dead. Outside, the sergeant's voice bellows harsh, commanding, and far too loud for the hour. You scramble to dress, muscles stiff from yesterday's march. 50 kilometers. That is what he called light conditioning. To your legs, it was punishment. You button your coarse wool jacket, the one with the red piping that identifies you as a fusilier, a foot soldier in Napoleon's mighty war machine. There is pride in the uniform, yes, but it scratches, it stinks, and it reminds you that comfort is now a foreign luxury. As you step outside into the morning chill, a low mist hangs over the camp, wrapping everything in ghostly silence. Somewhere beyond the fog lies Austria, and Russia, and war. This is not the romantic adventure you imagined. This is not the noble crusade painted in recruiting posters. This is hunger, frostbite, exhaustion. This is brotherhood, forged in fire. Songs sung on endless marches, and hope held together by tattered letters from home. This is history, raw, brutal, and all too human. If stories like this speak to you stories of resilience, sacrifice, and forgotten lives lived in the margins of greatness, then consider supporting this channel. A simple like or subscribe goes a long way. It tells the platform these stories matter, that these voices should not be lost to time. And maybe, just maybe, they help us see our own struggles through a different lens. Now, settle in. Take a breath. Let us walk alongside Jean Dupont as he takes his first step into the long, merciless road of war. Most soldiers had worn out boots, thin uniforms, and carried heavy gear, including muskets, cartridges, bayonets, and swords, often with minimal protection against the elements. For men like Jean Dupont, this was not just an inconvenience, it was the daily burden of survival. As dawn broke across the frost-covered fields of Europe, Jean would haul himself upright, brushing hay and lice from his tattered greatcoat, each joint aching from dampness and cold. His boots, if they could still be called that, were little more than stitched leather scraps held together by twine and desperation. The soles had long since surrendered to the endless miles of march. And frostbite was not a distant threat. It was an everyday fear that gnawed at his toes like the hunger gnawed at his belly. The uniform, once a proud blue trimmed with white piping, had faded into a grimy, sweat-stained gray blue that barely shielded him from the bitter wind. Each layer was thin, fraying at the cuffs and elbows, offering little comfort against rain, snow, or searing heat. There were no special winter kits for Napoleon's soldiers, no rotation of fresh gear. A coat was a treasure. A spare pair of socks, a luxury few ever knew. And so, these men, weary and underfed, faced the elements with only what they could carry, wear, or steal. Their gear was as much a curse as a tool of war. Each soldier shouldered a musket, an aging Charleville flintlock that was temperamental in damp weather and heavy on the march. It was accompanied by a cartridge box holding paper-wrapped powder and lead shot, a bayonet to be affixed for hand-to-hand desperation, and often a short sword or saber that added yet another pound of metal to his aching frame. Add to that a backpack, cooking kit, rations when available, a canteen, and perhaps a blanket or tent cloth. By the time Jean marched out of camp each morning, he was effectively hauling over 50 pounds on his back, and that was if he was not ordered to carry additional supplies, tools, or gear for the officers. The irony of glory was never lost on Jean. At recruitment, the posters had promised valor, medals, and the chance to serve the emperor himself. But the reality was a cold trench dug with a spoon, a blanket soaked in snowmelt, and the rot of frostbite creeping up through the legs. In battle, the bravado of bayonet charges quickly gave way to chaos. Thick clouds of black powder smoke choked the battlefield. Orders were lost in the roar of cannon and the screams of wounded men. The musket fired slowly, one shot every 20 or 30 seconds under stress, often misfiring or failing to ignite. Reloading meant biting open powder cartridges with trembling fingers, praying the flint would not fail, and then thrusting blindly forward as enemy cavalry descended like thunder. Jean had seen comrades drop dead mid-march from exhaustion alone. He had watched young men, still hopeful and full of patriotic fire, collapse in the mud and never rise again. And he had seen the unlucky ones, those wounded but not killed, left behind, sometimes by necessity, sometimes because the column simply could not stop. Mercy was a commodity the army could rarely afford. Yet for all of this, there was a strange pride. Jean belonged to something vast and historic. The Grande Armée moved like a living organism across Europe, its thousands of soldiers marching in rhythm, its banners fluttering above regimental drums. For brief moments, the fire of purpose could push back the fatigue, and Jean would remember why he joined to escape the farm, to find meaning, to fight for France. But the winters were unrelenting, and food was always scarce. The bread, when it came, was rock-hard and riddled with weevils. Meat, when it could be scrounged, came from questionable sources, half spoiled, often hoarse, sometimes worse. Hunger was constant. Soldiers boiled leather straps to chew on. Some resorted to stealing from civilians. Jean recalled once sharing a single onion with 3 other men. Over 2 days it was a feast by their standards. In Russia, things became unspeakably worse. The cold cut through their clothes like knives. Horses died by the hundreds, their frozen carcasses lining the roads. Men lit fires using parts of abandoned wagons, sometimes burning precious ammunition, just to stay alive through the night. Jean wrapped his feet in scraps of cloth torn from the dead. He no longer walked, he hobbled. And yet the retreat demanded he move or perish. By the time he reached friendly territory again, Jean was a ghost of the man who had enlisted. His skin was sunken, his eyes hollow. His coat hung off him like a sack. He had stopped dreaming, stopped praying, stopped even remembering some days. All that mattered was staying upright, staying warm, staying fed, if only barely. And somehow, through all the carnage and frost, Jean endured. He returned home, not as a hero on a white horse, but as a survivor with nothing left but scars, memories, and the weight of things he could never speak of. The villagers no longer recognized him, and even he struggled to remember who he once was. At night, when the wind howled, he could hear drums and cannon fire in the distance, though he knew they were long gone. His dreams were filled with names and faces lost to snow and smoke. War, in the end, was not glory. It was endurance. It was the silent, stubborn refusal to die when everything around you demanded it. And for Jean Dupont, that was enough. He had survived, and that was the only victory that truly mattered. Jean Dupont's feet had long forgotten what it meant to feel dry. Each morning, as the bugle called the men from restless slumber, he peeled himself off the damp straw mat, that served as a bed, joints stiff and muscles aching from the previous day's march. His boots, if they could still be called that, were more leather patchwork than proper footwear, soaked through and worn thin. The mud of half of Europe clung to them, a grim souvenir of every village passed, every hill crested, and every river crossed. The uniform he wore hung loosely on his gaunt frame. The blue wool faded and threadbare, offering little protection from wind or sleet. Yet none of that mattered at sunrise. The army moved with the light, and no one asked whether the men were ready. The days began in silence, not from peace, but from exhaustion. Orders barked by officers echoed down the line, and thousands of feet began their slow, synchronized advance along frozen roads or dusty paths, depending on the season. Jean had once been told that soldiers in Napoleon's army could march 50 kilometers in a single day. He thought it an exaggeration until he lived it step after punishing step, the sun burning overhead or hiding behind storm clouds that opened without warning. There was no respite. The column moved like a machine, fueled not by rations but by will, discipline, and the ever-fading promise of glory. Food was scarce. Sometimes they were lucky to get a crust of bread or a few boiled lentils. At other times they scoured the fields and barns of foreign lands, eyes darting for anything edible, apples not yet ripe, half-eaten meat scraps, even stolen eggs when opportunity struck. Jean had learned to quiet the moral voice inside him. Hunger made men forget civility. The army taught them that. It taught them to endure pain, to ignore the cries of their own bodies. Blisters bled freely inside boots too tight to remove. Shoulders ached under the weight of muskets, cartridge boxes, and bayonets. And still, they moved, always forward. At night, when the march paused and the camps were laid, the men collapsed onto the earth like felled trees. Fires were rare. Smoke could betray their position, and when they did spark small flames, they huddled in grim silence, warming hands, drying socks, or boiling whatever edible thing they would manage to procure. No one sang. The old songs of patriotism and triumph had faded weeks ago. In their place lingered groans, coughs, and the sound of boots being scraped clean with knives dulled from use. Jean kept a small token in his coat, a wooden cross carved by his brother before the war. He gripped it some nights, staring into the stars and wondering if the heavens looked any different above Paris. He did not believe in much anymore, but the stars reminded him of home. The others had their tokens too, folded letters, locks of hair, or medals from battles survived. They carried these not as proof of courage, but as silent prayers to stay alive. The marching was endless. From the green fields of Bavaria to the snowy plains of Eastern Europe, the army moved with frightening efficiency. It was said that Napoleon's strength lay not just in strategy, but in the stamina of his men. And that was true. Jean had seen friends collapse beside the road, their bodies spent, their spirits broken. They were not mourned long. There was no time. Their muskets were taken, boots stripped, and the march resumed. The living envied the dead at times, especially when the roads grew narrow and the rations thinner. Yet no one spoke such thoughts aloud. Discipline ruled the line more effectively than fear. And still, behind it all, there lingered that ghostly promise, glory. It had brought them here. It whispered to them during the worst moments. Jean remembered signing up, cheeks flushed with pride, imagining parades and medals. He had pictured himself charging across battlefields like Caesar's legions, sword raised, admired by all. But real battle looked nothing like that. It was loud and chaotic, smoke obscuring friend from foe, screams mingling with cannon fire, the soil slick with blood and ice. Glory was not a shining light on a hill. It was the glint of steel through the fog, and the hope that today the bullet would miss. The officers marched too, but rarely looked weary. Their uniforms remained clean, their voices sharp. They spoke of tactics and flanking maneuvers, of reinforcing bridges and capturing roads. To the men, these orders came like fate. Jean did not question them. Questioning brought punishment, or worse, suspicion. And so the men obeyed. dragging their bodies across continent after continent, turning from sons and farmers into soldiers molded by the grind of war. And yet, amid the misery, there was an unspoken bond. The men shared water when they had it, lifted each other from ditches, and buried their comrades with whatever dignity they could muster. Jean once tore the lining of his coat to wrap a wounded soldier's hand. That soldier did not survive the week, but the act reminded Jean that some humanity still lingered beneath the grime. By the third year, time had lost meaning. The calendar did not matter. Only the next march, the next camp, the next battle. Rumors of victories drifted down the line like fog. Napoleon had taken a city. Napoleon had crushed an enemy army. Jean wondered if those victories meant anything to the dead. For the rest, they were just mile markers on the road to exhaustion. He dreamed of home, often of warm bread, of music played from the church steps, of the Seine in autumn. But each dream ended the same way: the sound of a drum, the shout of an officer, the endless road, stretching forward. The march never truly ended. It lived in their bones. And as long as their emperor dreamed of empire, Jean and thousands like him would keep walking. Between the thunder of cannons and the screams of battle, there were long stretches of silence, harsh, cold, unforgiving silence. For soldiers in Napoleon's Grand Armée, life between battles was not marked by rest or luxury, but by the grinding monotony of survival. Their world was a haze of cold winds, damp ground, and the choking smell of unwashed uniforms. Meals came sporadically, often nothing more than a hard biscuit soaked in bitter broth, sometimes stretched with scavenged roots, or boiled horse meat if luck allowed. Hunger gnawed constantly, dulling their minds and hollowing their eyes. Shelter was a concept few truly knew. Some found rest beneath makeshift tents of canvas and bent branches. Others dug into the earth, creating shallow pits to escape the wind. Rain soaked through everything, turning boots into sponges and uniforms into clinging, icy wraps. Fires were precious, difficult to maintain, and when lit, drew men together like moths, desperate for warmth. They huddled close, steam rising from their damp coats, faces illuminated by the flickering light, hands trembling not just from cold but from the exhaustion that had seeped into their bones. Sleep, when it came, was never peaceful. It was a restless doze filled with groans and shivers, interrupted by orders barked in the dark or by the soft weeping of a man too far from home. Many slept on damp straw, others on bare ground, sometimes packed shoulder to shoulder beneath a single threadbare blanket. Lice were constant companions, biting through the night, spreading infection. Fevers took men faster than bullets, and yet, each morning, they rose slowly, painfully, and prepared to march once again. But amid this hardship, something extraordinary took root. Camaraderie, not the romanticized kind often sung in epic poems, but a hard-earned, bone-deep bond forged through shared suffering. In the dead hours between drills and marching, men told stories, some of home, others of battles they barely survived. They spoke of lost brothers, of warm bread and full bellies, of lovers left behind. These stories became lifelines, pulling them back from the edge of despair. Around low fires they sang in cracked voices, old folk tunes from the French countryside, drinking in the comfort of familiarity. Sometimes laughter broke through the gloom, a clever remark, a mimic of a grumbling officer, or the retelling of an absurd battlefield moment could erupt into bursts of genuine joy, if only for a moment. These fleeting joys were treasured more than gold. They reminded the men that they were still human, that beyond the uniform and the suffering, they were brothers, sons, fathers, and friends. It was in those moments, huddled in cold and hunger, that the Grande Armée truly found its soul, not in grand victories or glorious charges, but in the quiet defiance of men who refused to let hardship erase their spirit. Discipline kept them in line, but it was the unspoken pact between comrades that kept them going. When one stumbled from fatigue, another offered a hand. When a man fell ill, others shared what little they had, be it medicine, dry socks, or the last bite of bread. They fought not just for France or for the emperor, but for the men beside them, for the ones who had shared their stories, warmed their hands over the same fire, and whispered the same prayers into the cold night. Letters from home were rare and cherished like holy relics. When one arrived, it was read aloud, again and again, not just by the recipient, but by the whole group, as though it were a gift sent to them all. It reminded them of why they endured, why they marched, why they fought. Some even began to imagine each other's families as extensions of their own. In war, blood did not only bind, it was shared suffering that created new kinship. Still, nothing softened the harsh truth. The days were long, the nights longer. Supplies often failed to reach them. The commissariat was overburdened, supply lines stretched thin, and corruption ran deep. Flour was often moldy, meat sometimes rancid, and water, when available, tepid and brown. There were times when men roasted rats, seasoned only with desperation, their teeth grinding through sinew and bone. Yet still they endured. They endured because they had to, because to fall behind was to risk being left behind, and to be left behind was to vanish from history, nameless and forgotten. Glory was a distant dream. For most, survival was enough, and in that endless struggle, they found moments of grace not from their commanders or the heavens, but from one another. When they marched together not in silence, but in song. Even the most exhausted would tap a rhythm against his musket, hum a tune from his childhood, or whisper lyrics that once made his mother smile. These were not battle hymns, but lullabies for the soul. They reminded each man that despite the mud, the hunger, and the pain, he was still alive, he was still a man. And together they would march again tomorrow. At battles like Austerlitz, the very air seemed to crack and rupture with thunderous cannon blasts. The earth trembled beneath the feet of the marching columns, and the sky filled with thick, black smoke that choked even the most seasoned soldier. For men like Jean Dupont, this was not a moment of glory sung by poets. It was chaos incarnate. He had marched for weeks in tattered boots and slept in frozen mud, only to arrive at a battlefield where life could vanish in the blink of an eye. The cold morning of December 2nd, 1805, began with anticipation and uncertainty. Orders were shouted through the mist, barely audible over the roar of artillery. Muskets cracked like firecrackers across the valley, and men fell, some dead before their bodies hit the ground, others writhing in pain and disbelief. Jean could barely see a few meters ahead. The fog of war was not just a metaphor. It was literal. The smoke from cannons and gunfire blanketed the field, turning orderly formations into stumbling mobs of frightened, shouting men. Jean clutched his musket tighter than ever, his gloved hands trembling. Around him, comrades he had shared bread and laughter with the night before were now screaming, bleeding, or deathly silent. He watched a boy, no older than 16, fall to his knees after a cannonball took off his leg. The boy did not cry. He just stared at the stump in disbelief, until another explosion silenced him forever. Jean wanted to help, but knew that stopping meant death. He stepped over the body and pressed on, teeth clenched, eyes wide with fear. The officers barked orders, advance, hold the line. But even they knew that control was slipping. The field turned muddy with blood and churned earth, and every step forward felt like wading through the wreckage of humanity. Bayonets gleamed in the pale winter sun, and soon it was no longer a matter of shooting at distant enemies. It was face to face. Jean plunged his bayonet forward, not seeing a uniform, not even a face, just motion, threat, instinct. He did not know if the man he stabbed had a family, dreams, or even a name. He did not have time to care. Fear clung to every heartbeat. It was not the kind of fear one could overcome with courage, but the kind that stayed, heavy and unshakable, like a wet coat in the cold. Jean saw men freeze in place, paralyzed by the chaos, only to be cut down in moments. Others screamed prayers, curses, or the names of loved ones. Each man was alone, in his own terror, yet bound together by a shared desperation to live. By midday, the battlefield was unrecognizable. Piles of bodies marked where regiments had clashed most fiercely. Horses thrashed in agony with shattered legs. The wounded called out, voices growing weaker as they lay untended in the dirt. And yet, even amid such horror, the drums beat on. Flags still waved above the smoke. Orders were still given, though few could follow them. Jean survived that day, though he never knew how. Perhaps it was luck. Perhaps it was the reflexes drilled into him by months of grueling marches and drills. He had a small cut across his cheek and blood on his coat that was not his. As the sounds of gunfire faded and the sun dipped behind the hills, he sat among the wreckage in silence. He could hear a bird chirping faintly, oblivious to the carnage. That absurd little sound made him cry quietly so no one could hear. Night fell, and the survivors gathered into exhausted, hollow-eyed groups. They ate what little bread remained and wrapped themselves in torn blankets, scavenged from the dead. Some muttered prayers. Others just stared into the dark. Jean did not speak. He lay back, gazing at the stars, wondering if anyone back home would ever know what he had seen, what he had done, or what he had become. The Battle of Austerlitz would go down in history as one of Napoleon's greatest victories. Strategists would praise the tactics, historians would debate the genius, and generals would study the maneuvers for generations. But for men like Jean, it was something else entirely. It was the day he became a different person, a survivor. Yes, but also a witness to the unraveling of human dignity under fire. And though he had lived through it, a part of him remained on that frozen field, buried among the smoke and screams and silence, haunted not only by the sharp bite of hunger and cold, but by shadows that clung to them long after the battlefield had gone silent. Soldiers in Napoleon's Grande Armée bore wounds that went far deeper than musket balls or saber cuts. These were men like Jean Dupont, who marched for days on aching feet and rested his head on a lice-ridden blanket, only to be shaken awake by dreams more vivid than reality. Visions of comrades falling, of orders shouted through gun smoke, of the ringing silence that followed each clash. It was not merely their bodies that suffered. Long before they faced enemy lines, many had begun their war within. The emotional toll of daily survival, of watching friends vanish in bursts of cannon fire, of hearing the dying call out to mothers who would never know where their sons fell, etched itself into the soul. There was no medicine for such things, no salve for a memory that refused to fade. And yet, somehow, they kept moving. From the barracks to the battlefield, their lives were governed by orders, routine, and the illusion that endurance would bring them glory, or at least survival. But deep down, they understood that each day was borrowed time. A single misstep, a stray shot, or a failed order could mean the end. This awareness did not spark panic. It created numbness. Fear became a constant companion, less like a shout and more like a whisper at the back of the mind. At Austerlitz, the famed Battle of the Three Emperors, that fear exploded into chaos. The sun rose that day like any other, cold and indifferent. Then came the roar of cannons, the thunder of hooves, the blinding smog of gunpowder hanging over the frozen fields. Jean could not remember how many times he fired his musket, or how many bayonets lunged at him. He remembered the mud swallowing fallen men, the ice cracking under boots, and the awful stillness after the storm passed. That day, over 30,000 men were killed, wounded, or captured. And Jean survived, but he left part of himself behind. No amount of singing at camp or shared laughter over moldy bread could erase the scars battles left on their minds. Brotherhood was forged not only through fire, but through the quiet, unbearable weight of knowing that the man beside you might not be there tomorrow. Some coped by telling stories of home, of lovers, of old victories that now felt like fairy tales. Others carved simple shapes into wooden flasks, or stitched little trinkets into their uniforms, reminders of who they were before war changed everything. Night was the worst. It was when the world grew quiet enough for the mind to speak. In the stillness, the memories came alive. The shriek of a wounded horse, the last breath of a friend who never finished his sentence, the ache of limbs that could no longer run, of hopes that no longer stirred. Some men cried silently beneath their coats. Others stared into the darkness, waiting for the next march, the next order, anything to distract from the thoughts that gnawed at them like rats. And yet, despite all of it, they did not break. Perhaps that was the cruelest miracle of all. The mental burden these men carried did not make them less brave. It made their courage almost tragic. They fought, not because they felt invincible, but because they knew the cost, and stepped forward anyway. For some, the war ended with discharge papers or limping returns home. For others, it ended in shallow graves far from their birthplace. But no soldier who survived returned untouched. They came back changed, some quieter, some angrier, some lost. They carried memories like shrapnel embedded deep within the soul, pieces that no surgeon could remove. History remembers the names of generals, the size of armies, the maps of conquests. But within the pages lies another story, one written in the minds of men like Jean, who lived each day not knowing whether it would be his last, who endured horrors with no medal to show, and who walked off the battlefield carrying more than any uniform was ever meant to hold. Their story is not one of endless heroism or glorious victories. It is one of survival, resilience, and the quiet, invisible cost of war. And perhaps, in remembering that, we honor them most. Even before the roar of cannons marked the start of battle, many soldiers had already faced another kind of torment, one that began the moment they left camp. The long marches under the searing sun or freezing rain pushed them to their limits, each step a test of willpower. Their boots, often worn thin, failed to cushion the relentless impact on dirt paths and cobblestone roads. Their uniforms, little more than thin cloth, offered no real protection against the elements. Yet they pressed on, driven by orders, pride, and the ever-glowing myth of valor. Some days, they covered up to 50 kilometers without proper food or sleep. Their gear weighed heavily, muskets slung over their shoulders, cartridge pouches banging against their hips, bayonets and sabers strapped to their sides. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs. Fatigue clouded their minds. But discipline, strict and often enforced through harsh means, kept them moving. Many clung to dreams of glory, of medals, of being remembered. But as the days wore on, that illusion wore thin. In the lulls between battles, life did not get much easier. Rations were meager, hard bread that broke more teeth than hunger, salted meat that spoiled quickly, and, when lucky, a cup of watery soup. Shelters were crude, at best tents that flapped wildly in the wind, or open fields where the sky offered no mercy. Yet amidst this hardship, bonds formed. Soldiers gathered around small fires, their laughter occasionally rising above the whistling wind. They sang old songs, told stories of home, invented jokes to distract themselves from the cold or the fear that clung to them like a second skin. In these shared moments, brotherhood bloomed. The man beside you was not just another recruit. He was family. Then came the battles, Austerlitz, Borodino, Wagram names, that would be etched into the pages of history, but remembered by the men only for the chaos they brought. On the morning of combat, everything changed. The air was thick with tension, like the world itself held its breath. As drums rolled and horns blared, lines of soldiers advanced, their boots crunching over frosted grass or muddy fields. Then, like a storm breaking, the first cannon fired. Earth trembled beneath their feet. Smoke blurred vision. Musket volleys cracked through the air, followed by screams, some of rage, some of agony. There was no room for hesitation. In moments, formations broke down. The neat rows became clusters, then frenzied scrambles. Men fought at arm's length, bayonets clashing, sabers swinging. The ground quickly turned slick, not with water but with blood. Those who fell cried out for help, but the tide of battle rarely allowed rescue. Fear became a constant companion. Some said the brave were merely those too numb to shake, and when the smoke cleared, the fields lay silent, except for the moans of the wounded and the occasional whimper of those still clinging to life. For the survivors, there was no triumph, only disbelief. That they were still standing while others were not felt less like strength and more like chance. Luck, they whispered, pure luck. But survival did not mean escape. The wounds went deeper than the skin. Nightmares returned in the silence of sleep. Flashbacks interrupted even moments of peace. Some withdrew into themselves. Others drank heavily, trying to silence memories of what they had seen and done. Mental strain became as dangerous as any enemy, yet no one spoke of it aloud. To appear shaken was to appear weak, and weakness was unwelcome in a world where death waited at every corner. Worse still was the grim reality of injury. Field surgeries, if they could be called that, were brutal affairs. Carried out near the battlefield, often in tents or barns, they lacked both proper tools and anesthesia. A wounded soldier would be held down by his comrades while the surgeon, with hands trained more by necessity than science, got to work. Alcohol was poured over the wound to clean it, but the sting it brought was nothing compared to what followed. If the limb was shattered or infected, amputation was the only option, and it had to be done quickly. Sutures were made using threads of animal gut. The pain was excruciating. Some fainted from it. Others screamed until their voices broke. Even if the surgery succeeded, infection remained a looming threat. The smell of rot, the fevered eyes, the silent prayers. These became the rhythm of recovery, and many never returned to the front. But they still bore the scars, reminders of a war that continued within long after the battle outside had ended. And through it all, life marched on. New recruits arrived. Old faces disappeared. Letters from home were read and reread until the ink faded. The war machine never truly stopped, and those caught in its gears learned quickly. Survival was not just about muscle or obedience. It was about enduring physically, mentally, and spiritually. Because in the end, history would remember the victories and defeats, the strategies and generals. But it was the common soldier, bruised and battered, who carried that history on his shoulders, one step at a time. Even when boots wore thin and frost bit through bone, the mere sight of Napoleon could ignite something deep in the hearts of weary soldiers. His silhouette, on horseback rigid, commanding, strangely calm, was enough to make men straighten their backs, tighten their grips, and forget, if only for a moment, the exhaustion that weighed on their limbs. He was not just a general to them. He was the symbol of a dream, of glory, of a France that was destined for greatness. They followed him not because they were blind to the cost, but because he made them believe that the cost was worth paying. By the time a man had marched hundreds of kilometers, endured bitter snows and endless mud, watched friends collapse from hunger or wounds, and still managed to lift his musket, it was no longer just duty that kept him going, it was belief. Belief that what they were building together, this empire, this legacy, mattered, that it would live on long after their bodies were gone. And Napoleon fed that belief like a skilled storyteller feeds a fire, never letting it die, even as the darkness around them grew heavier. But belief alone could not block out the sound of screams from the medical tents, the cries of those who had not been lucky enough to die quickly. Men whose limbs were shattered by grape shot or crushed by cavalry charges were dragged back to the surgeons who worked with speed but without mercy. There was no anesthesia, no comfort, just a wooden stick to bite down on, and a prayer that affection would not finish what the battlefield had started. The stink of blood and rot followed the army like a second shadow. And yet, men still rode forward when Napoleon raised his hand. The deeper the army plunged into foreign lands, the more their world shrank to simple truths. March. Eat if you can. Don't fall behind. sleep with one eye open. When orders came down, they did not question them. They packed up what little they had and kept moving. Their world was cold steel, smoke, and the occasional roar of Vive l'Empereur. That rang out not because they had to shout it, but because something inside them still wanted to. They found comfort where they could in each other. Fireside songs carried memories of distant homes, a shared ration of bread, a joke muttered in the dark, or a letter passed between hands became lifelines. Comrades were not just fellow soldiers, they were family. They buried each other when they could, and when they could not, they whispered a name and moved on, because that was the only way to survive. Still, battles like Austerlitz shattered any illusions of control. Once the drums began and the lines moved forward, the world descended into a chaos that no drill or command could truly master. Smoke swallowed the sun. Cannons tore through flesh and ground alike, and when the musket volleys faded, there was only hand-to-hand struggle, a blur of fear, fury, and desperation. Some lived. Many did not. No one could predict which it would be. There was no fairness, only luck and instinct. In the quiet that followed, the survivors would sit among the wreckage silent, hollowed out by what they had seen. And yet, even then, when Napoleon passed by, wounded men tried to stand. They lifted their hats or tried to cheer, voices hoarse from blood and smoke, because if he still rode, they could too. The cost of that loyalty, however, grew heavier with every campaign. Spain, Russia, the long winters and longer marches, the glory began to fray. Rumors whispered through the ranks. Desertions increased. Even the most loyal eyes grew tired. But when the emperor spoke of victory, of destiny, of honor, some spark always returned, if only briefly. He knew how to make them feel seen, how to remind them that they were part of something greater. Not all were convinced forever. Some broke. Some vanished into the woods. But those who stayed were not fools or fanatics. They were men who had given so much already that turning back no longer seemed like a real choice. Napoleon had carried them this far. To abandon him felt like abandoning everything they had become. And so they followed. Through snowdrifts and sieges, through victories and defeats they marched. Because the dream still flickered in their minds. Because they could still see his shape on the horizon. Because no matter how heavy their packs or how raw their feet, when he looked at them, it felt for a fleeting second that history itself had chosen them. They were tired, battered, and haunted, but they were not broken. Not yet. No soldier could have imagined the horrors that awaited them on the long march into Russia. The summer of 1812 began with such confidence, with Napoleon at the head of the largest army Europe had ever seen. Nearly 500,000 men crossed into Russian territory under a banner of imperial ambition, driven by discipline, dreams of glory, and blind faith in their leader. But what began as a campaign of conquest soon twisted into a nightmare that devoured both flesh and spirit. The roads grew longer, the villages more sparse, and the resistance more elusive. Russian forces refused to offer open battle, retreating deeper into their vast homeland, burning everything in their wake. Fields were scorched, wells poisoned, homes abandoned. The Grande Armée found itself chasing a ghost, stretched thin across unfamiliar terrain, their supplies dwindling and morale quietly eroding. Still, the men marched, trusting in the promise of victory, trusting Napoleon. Then came the Battle of Borodino. It was brutal. A single day of slaughter, where cannonballs tore through ranks, where bayonets clashed in muddy trenches, and where blood mixed with the dust of the Russian steppe. Tens of thousands perished. The French technically won, but there was no joy in it, just exhaustion. Moscow lay ahead, but when they reached it, the city had been emptied and set ablaze. There was no peace, no shelter, no sign of surrender, only smoke, ash, and silence. It was as if the land itself had turned against them. And then, winter came. The temperature plummeted with terrifying speed. The soldiers' summer uniforms offered little protection as the first snow began to fall. Horses collapsed by the hundreds, their frozen bodies soon covered by the growing drifts. Cannon wheels froze solid, muskets jammed, fingers blackened with frostbite. Firewood was scarce, and even the act of lighting a flame became a struggle against the wind. Hunger became constant. The little bread they had turned to stone in their packs. Men chewed leather, scavenged frozen roots, even consumed the flesh of fallen animals, or worse. But the cold was only one enemy. Cossack raiders struck without warning, slashing through the retreating lines like shadows on horseback. They harassed the flanks, ambushed the rear, and disappeared into the forests before the French could regroup. Each day, the number of men dwindled not just from wounds or frostbite, but from the simple inability to keep going. Soldiers collapsed in the snow, too weak to stand, and were quietly buried beneath the ice by the next snowfall. There were no markers, no prayers, just silence. By the time they reached the Berezina River, the retreat had become a rout. The river was half frozen, treacherous, and swollen from melting ice. Makeshift bridges were built under fire, and thousands drowned, or were trampled in the chaos. Entire divisions vanished in the current. Those who made it across did so with hollow eyes, shivering in rags, clinging to fragments of weapons and memories. The Grande Armée was no longer an army. It was a scattered procession of survivors staggering westward through an endless white wasteland. And still, in the midst of this horror, the figure of Napoleon rode at the front. He barely spoke, wrapped in layers of fur, but his presence lingered like a fading torch. For some, it remained a symbol of hope. For others, it became a bitter reminder of promises unfulfilled. The man who once led them to victory after victory now led them through ruin. Only a fraction of the original force returned to France. Of the hundreds of thousands who had begun the campaign, perhaps 1 in 10 lived to tell the tale. And even then, they returned, changed, not just physically, but spiritually. The survivors carried with them stories of frozen nights under endless skies, of comrades lost without a sound, of the helplessness of fighting not just an enemy army, but the land itself. The Russian campaign marked a turning point, not just in Napoleon's fortunes, but in the souls of those who followed him. It stripped away the illusions of invincibility and revealed the terrible price of ambition. For the common soldier, it was not strategy or glory that remained, but the frostbitten march through snow-choked forests, the groaning of starving horses, the ghostly silence of a dead city. In the end, it was not the Russian army that destroyed the Grande Armée. It was Russia itself. The sheer scale, the cruelty of the climate, the relentlessness of nature's indifference, and for those who lived through it, survival was not a triumph, but a haunting echo that stayed with them for the rest of their lives. As the Grande Armée stumbled through the frozen wastelands of Russia, the line between survival and civility began to blur. Food was no longer a matter of rationing. It had become a desperate pursuit. Bread, meat, even scraps of spoiled vegetables were more valuable than gold. Soldiers who had once marched in neat columns now wandered in scattered bands, their once shining uniforms reduced to rags. Amid the biting cold and howling wind, they scoured villages for anything edible. Some knocked on doors and begged with hollow eyes. Others, starved beyond reason, broke into homes, taking what they could. Hunger stripped away the discipline of the battlefield faster than cannon fire ever could. But even then, not all men surrendered to chaos. Jean, a mid-ranking officer whose name rarely appears in the official records, became a pillar of order amid the collapse. His men respected him, not out of fear, but because he tried against every odd to hold on to their humanity. Jean understood that the army was no longer fighting the Russians, but fighting itself. Hunger, frostbite, despair. He had seen soldiers collapse and not rise again, not because they were wounded, but because they had lost the will to take another step. And so he tried to give them reasons to carry on. When his unit stumbled upon a small Russian village, half buried in snow and abandoned by most of its residents, Jean ordered his men to approach with care. He reminded them of their oaths, of the cause they once believed in, even if that cause now seemed as distant as France itself. "We are soldiers of Napoleon," he whispered to a weary corporal. "Not marauders, not monsters." His words were not always enough. That day, a young conscript named Alain, barely 17 and half mad with hunger, tried to steal food from a frightened peasant woman. Jean intervened, pulling him back, not with punishment, but with compassion. "If we lose who we are," he said, "we have already died, even if we still walk." Alain wept that night, not from pain, but from shame, and Jean sat beside him in the snow, sharing the last crust of blackened bread he had been saving for days. Still, discipline was a fragile thing. In the larger towns, some units became uncontrollable. Looting turned to violence, and civilians suffered. Jean's men saw this as they passed through Smolensk, and the horror etched itself into their minds. They saw what happened when hunger consumed not just the body, but the soul. Jean used these moments not to preach, but to teach. "Look," he told them, gesturing to a burnt house where a mother cradled her crying child, "we are not the only ones suffering." Jean's quiet leadership did not save everyone. It could not. Men still died by the roadside, some with icicles forming on their beards, others with empty eyes staring skyward. But within his small company, a kind of code survived. They shared food when they had it. They buried their dead when they could. And when they left a village, they tried to leave it standing. By the time they reached the Berezina River, the retreat had turned into a nightmare. The crossing was chaos, carts overturned, horses frozen mid-step, bodies crushed underfoot. Jean's men, battered and broken, held together not by orders but by the unspoken understanding that they were all each other had. As cannons roared in the distance and Russian cavalry circled like wolves, Jean led them across the bridge, shouting not commands but names, refusing to let anyone vanish into the snow without being missed. In the end, only a handful survived. Jean himself was found weeks later by a French patrol, frostbitten and unconscious but alive. He never spoke much of the retreat, not even when he returned to France. But those who had followed him remembered. They remembered the man who, amid starvation and suffering, insisted that even in the worst of times, there was a right way to be human. They'd already marched through a land that seemed to fight back with every step. The cold had become a second skin, the wind their eternal companion. When they finally reached the Berezina River, it was not merely a barrier of water, but the final test of will. For weeks, Napoleon's army had dwindled hunger, gnawed at their bellies, frost clung to their bones, and the silence of missing comrades haunted every nightfall. And now, before them, the Berezina churned like a final gatekeeper between survival and oblivion. The river was half frozen, deceptive in its stillness, but beneath the icy crust ran a current swift and merciless. Worse, the Russians were closing in from both sides. It was not a question of strategy anymore. It was a question of time, and how many lives it would take to cross. Jean stood among the weary, his boots soaked through, his uniform reduced to rags. He was no longer the eager soldier who had once marched under banners embroidered with imperial eagles. Now he was a survivor, bone-tired but driven by something even deeper than duty, an instinct to endure. The engineers, under the command of General Iblet, knew the stakes. Bridges had to be built immediately, or the entire Grande Armée would be trapped, encircled, and annihilated. But there was no wood, no proper materials, no protection. The only resource they had left was courage, and that, at least, had not yet frozen. They began to work, hacking down what remained of nearby trees, using sledges, barrels, and abandoned carts to craft supports. Soldiers waded waist-deep into the glacial water, anchoring planks, while musket fire rained from across the banks. Some were struck by bullets before they could even set a beam in place. Others collapsed from the cold alone. Their bodies drifted downriver, silently swallowed by the current. Still, others took their place. The sight was enough to make hardened veterans weep. Men who had survived Austerlitz and Wagram now stood helpless, watching comrades sacrifice themselves, not in battle, but in a desperate labor of salvation. Jean's hands bled as he helped secure ropes, passing frozen nails between trembling fingers. Around him, others muttered prayers, or shouted for their mothers, or simply worked in silence, each blow of a hammer, a protest against fate. It took 2 days to erect the makeshift bridges. 2 days of relentless Russian artillery, of sleet and snow, of cries from the wounded and the drowned. But by the morning of the 3rd day, the crossing stood fragile, creaking, but real, like veins of hope stretched across a body on the verge of collapse. The retreat began immediately. First the wounded, bundled on carts or carried by their comrades, then the stragglers, the cook boys, the supply wagons, and finally, the remnants of Napoleon's once proud divisions. Chaos reigned. Horses reared and slipped, wagons overturned, and men pushed and shoved in desperation to reach the other side. The bridges groaned under the weight. Jean found himself in the crush, guiding a small group of fellow grenadiers through the human tide. Every step on the icy planks was a gamble. The river below waited, dark and endless. A cannonball struck the near side of the bank, splintering a nearby cart. Shouts erupted, followed by screams. Still, the men moved forward. Halfway across, the bridge shifted. A beam snapped. Men fell, clawing at ropes or each other, vanishing into the Berezina's grip. Jean barely managed to keep his balance, pulling one younger soldier back by the collar before they tumbled in together. Behind them, the rear guard prepared to hold the Russians off as long as possible. Many would not make it across. They knew it. They stayed anyway. That night, after the crossing was complete and the remnants of the army camped in what shelter they could find, Jean sat by a dying fire. Around him, men wrapped in tattered coats tried to sleep, their faces hollow and aged beyond recognition. Somewhere nearby, someone softly hummed a lullaby, though no one knew if it was meant for the living or the dead. Jean looked back toward the river, now distant and invisible in the dark, but never to be forgotten. It had taken so much too much, yet it had also revealed something rare, something the cold could not steal. Sacrifice, not for victory or medals, but for each other. Not every man had crossed, but every man who tried had carved a place in memory. Later, Napoleon would speak of Berezina not as a defeat, but as a moment of heroism. Perhaps he was right, in his own way, but for Jean and the others who had lived it, the river was not a symbol. It was a grave, a passage between the army they once were and the shadows they had become. They had followed the emperor through glory and ruin. And now, with Russia behind them and the rest of Europe waiting, they marched on, not with pride, but with the heavy steps of those who had looked into the abyss and kept moving, because that, more than anything, was what it meant to survive the retreat. Years passed. The world changed, borders shifted, and empires that once seemed eternal crumbled into memory. Yet Jean remained a quiet figure in the corner of a village square, watching children play and smoke curl from chimneys as life moved on. The war was long over, but its echoes clung to him like the frost of a Russian winter that never fully melted. He did not wear his uniform anymore, nor did he boast of medals or tales of heroism. His scars were not just on his body. They were woven into the way he walked, the silence in his gaze, the careful patience with which he listened. Sometimes, curious villagers, young boys with dreams of glory, or older men who had only heard stories from their grandfathers, would approach and ask, "Did you fight with Napoleon? Were you at Austerlitz? Did you march into Moscow? Did you win?" Jean would smile faintly, eyes distant, looking not at the questioner but through them, into the past, into fields of blood, forests of snow, and the hollow faces of friends long buried. He never gave them the answer they expected. No tales of grand charges or noble duels. Just 5 words. "I survived," he would say. To most it seemed a simple reply, but to those who had truly listened, to the weight in his voice, to the pause before the words, to the unspoken memories, those 5 words were a monument. They carried the full weight of hunger, cold, pain, loyalty, and loss. They carried the image of young men freezing in their boots, of friends left behind in the snow, of horses collapsing in exhaustion, and of a man once full of dreams who had walked through the very worst of what humans could endure, and returned not whole but still standing. Surviving was not an absence of defeat, it was a triumph beyond victory. It was the final chapter in a story written in blood and courage. As the world around him grew quieter, Jean found peace in the ordinary. He never spoke ill of Napoleon, nor did he glorify him. He had seen the emperor ride through ranks of half-starved men and watched them straighten their backs with pride. He had also seen the price paid for that inspiration, seen it carved into the faces of those who followed. He understood both sides of greatness, and it made him wise in a way no book or medal could ever bestow. The younger generation would never fully grasp what he had lived through, and maybe that was for the best. They lived in a time of peace, at least for now, and Jean hoped they would never learn wars, language, the way he had. But perhaps, through stories like his, some understanding could be passed on, not of tactics or politics, but of the human heart, of what it means to endure, to care for the man beside you even, when the world is falling apart, to cling to your humanity when all else is stripped away. So if you have followed this journey, if you have walked with Jean through fire, snow, and silence, I thank you. His story is not just about Napoleon or Russia or even survival. It is about what war does to people, and how those people, if they are lucky, find a way to carry on. If this story moved you, taught you something new, or made you see history through a different lens, please consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with others who might find value in these forgotten echoes of the past. Every bit of support helps us bring more stories like Jean's back into the light. And now, after a long day of history and remembrance, I wish you a peaceful night. May your dreams be warm, your rest undisturbed, and may you always treasure peace, not because it is easy, but because you now understand the true cost of its absence. Good night.